The related naval battles of Barfleur and La Hogue took place between the 29th of May and the 4th of June New Style, 1692 Julian calendar then in use in England. The first action took place near Barfleur and is also known as Battle of Tourville. Later actions were at Cherbourg and St. Vaast La Hogue in the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy, France. It was the decisive naval battle of the 9 Years' War, known to the British as the War of the English Succession. In May 1692, the French fleet of 44 ships of the line under the command of Admiral Hilarion de Constantine, Comte de Tourville, was preparing to transport an invading army of Franco-Irish troops to restore James II to the English throne. Despite Tourville being in command of the fleet, strategic decisions were to be taken by James II. François d'Ursin de Bonreport and Bernardine Gigot de Bellefonds. The French victory at the Battle of Beachy Head 2 years earlier, in June 1690, had opened up the possibility of destroying the Allied fleet and landing an invading army. Tourville boldly engaged the 82-vessel Anglo-Dutch fleet at Barfleur. After a fierce but indecisive clash that left many ships on both sides damaged, Tourville disengaged. He slipped off into light fog and for several days tried to escape the superior forces. The French fleet was scattered, and 15 were lost, 3 at Cherbourg and a further 12 at La Hogue. The threat of invasion of England was lifted. Prelude. King Louis XIV and his naval minister, Count Pontchartrain, planned to land an army in England and restore James II to the throne. They first planned to launch the invasion in April 1692, before the English and Dutch fleets put to sea and joined up. Troops were collected at St. Vaast La Hogue, and the cavalry and guns were to be loaded into transports at Le Havre. Tourville was to bring the French fleet up from Brest and collect the transports and the troops, then fight off the English fleet and land the army in England. However, the French fleet was unable to concentrate in time. D'Estrées and the Toulon fleet were beaten back at the Straits of Gibraltar, losing 2 ships in a storm, and Villette-Mersay with the Rochefort squadron was delayed. Tourville's Brest fleet was undermanned, and when he sailed, on the 29th of April, he was forced to leave 20 ships under Chateau Renaud behind. His fleet was further delayed by adverse winds and did not clear Berthoum roads until the 2nd of May. Tourville entered the Channel with 37 ships of the line, accompanied by 7 fireships, plus frigates, scouts, and transports. He was joined on the 15th of May by Villette and the Rochefort squadron, 7 ships of the line and attendant vessels, giving Tourville a combined fleet of 44 ships, plus attendant vessels 70 or 80 sail altogether. Meanwhile, the Allied fleet was assembling at St. Helens on the Isle of Wight. Vice Admiral of the Red Sir Ralph de Laval arrived off St. Helens on the 8th of May. Next day, he was joined by Carter, who had been in the Western Channel guarding a convoy, and delivering troops to Guernsey. The Dutch had dispatched a fleet, under Armanda, from the Texel in April, which was making its way south. Admiral of the Blue Sir John Ashby sailed from the Nore on the 27th of April. Admiral of the fleet Edward Russell was delayed until the 29th of April, but gained time by making a risky passage through the Gulf Channel. He met Armanda at the Downs and a further Dutch squadron at Dungeness, arriving at St. Helens in the second week of May. More detachments joined over the next few days, until the 14th of May, when Russell had a force of over 80 ships of the line, plus auxiliaries. Thus by the 14th of May, when the Allied fleet was fully assembled, the French strategic aim of acting with a concentrated force while the Allies were scattered was already lost. However, Louis XIV had furnished Tourville with strict orders to seek battle, strong or weak, and this he proceeded to do. Battle of Barfleur. The fleets sighted each other at first light on the 29th of May 1692, off Cap Barfleur. On sighting the Allied fleet, Tourville held a conference with his officers. Their advice, and his own opinion, was against action. However, Tourville felt bound by strict orders from the king to engage. He may also have expected some defections by English captains with Jacobite sympathies, though in this he was to be disappointed. In the light southwesterly breeze the fleet slowly closed Russell from the northeast, and Tourville, who had the weather gauge from the south, on a starboard tack to bring his line of battle into contact with Russell's. Both fleets were in 3 squadrons, each split into 3 divisions and commanded by a flag officer. Because of the calm conditions, it was not until after 11 a.m., 5 hours after first sighting each other, that the 2 fleets engaged. Elsewhere, he sought to minimize damage by extending and refusing the van, to avoid them being turned and overwhelmed, while the rear was held back to keep the weather gauge. Russell countered by holding fire as long as possible, to allow the French to come closer. Armender, in the van, extended to try to overlap the French line, while Admiral Ashby, with the rear and some way off, sought to close and bring his Blue Squadron into action. From around 11 a.m., and for the next few hours, both fleets bombarded each other, causing considerable damage. The battle continued for the rest of the day and into the night and was full of incident. At 1 p.m. a change in the wind allowed Rear Admiral of the Red So Cloudsley Chaville to break the French line and the Dutch to start enveloping the French van. At 4 p.m. a flat calm descended, leaving both fleets in a fog. At 6 p.m. Tourville was able to use the tide to gain a respite, and at 8 p.m. Chaville used the same tide for a fireship attack. By 10 p.m. the battle was almost over. Surprisingly, though most ships on both sides were damaged, and some severely, no ships from either battle line were lost. At the turn of the tide, Tourville again took advantage of this to cut cables and be carried down channel on the ebb, away from the scene of battle. Russell also cut when he realized what had happened, to give chase into the night. Aftermath. On the 30th of May the French withdrawal was hampered by wind and tide and by the fact that, due to cost concerns by the French Naval Ministry, many of the ships had anchors inadequate to withstand the strong tidal races in the region. There was also the lack of a fortified haven at Cherbourg. Tourville probably tried for too long to save his magnificent flagship, the Soleil Royal, but eventually he realized it was hopeless and switched his command to the Ambitieux, the flagship of Ile-et-Meursault. Pursued first light on the 30th of May saw the French fleet scattered into groups across a wide area. To the north of the battle scene, and heading northward, were Gaboret and Langeron, with 4 ships between them. Later that day they skirted the English coast and headed out into the Atlantic. Eventually, they would arrive safely at Brest. To the south, Nesmond, with 6 ships, was heading southeast towards the Normandy coast. 2 of these would be beached at St. Vaast La Hogue, while another 2 would later put into Le Havre, where L'Entendu was wrecked at the harbour entrance. Nesmond, with the remaining 2 ships Monarch and Aimable, passed through the Straits of Dover, went north around Britain and finally arrived safely at Brest. Heading west was the main body in 3 groups. Villers leading with 15, followed by Damfreville with 12, and Tourville bringing up the rear with 7. During the day the French were able to close up, but Tourville was hampered by his efforts to save his flagship, Soleil Royal, which was in a pitiable condition. Later that day Tourville recognized this and transferred his flag to Lambetou. In pursuit was Philips van Armender and the Dutch fleet, with the various English divisions scattered behind. Many of these, particularly those of the English Red, were hampered by damage and lagged behind, leaving Armender and Ashby closed up to the French by the end of the day. Russell was forced to detach 3 ships to return to port for repairs. Later these sighted Gaboret's group, but neither engaged. Chaville had to move his flag to Kent due to the damage to his flagship Royal William, while the damage to Britannia, Russell's flagship, caused his division serious delay. On the 31st of May the French fleet was anchored against the tide off Cap de La Hogue. The leading contingent, 21 ships under Panettiere, had rounded the Cape and was in the Alderney race, while the remainder, 13 with Tourville and the other flag officers were to the east. As the weather deteriorated, these ships began to drag their anchors and were forced to cut and run before the wind and tide. 3 of the most badly damaged were forced to beach at Cherbourg. The rest, 10 ships, reached St. Vaast La Hogue where they too were beached, joining the 2 of Nesmond's division that were already there. Russell's and the ships with him, together with some of Ashby's Blue Squadron, also cut to pursue him, while Ashby and Armender continued to shadow Panettiere group. Panettiere, in order to escape the pursuing Allied fleet, sought to make the hazardous passage through the Alderney race. In this he was helped by finding in his crew a local man, Hervé Riel, to act as pilot when his navigators demurred. Armender and Ashby did not try to follow him and were criticized later by Russell for not doing so. Although the only flag officer who knew the waters, Carter, had died of his wounds, Armender attempted pursuit by taking his squadron west of Alderney, but the delay allowed Panettiere to pull too far ahead, and Armender abandoned the chase. Panettiere later reached St. Malo in safety, while Armender and Ashby turned east to rejoin Russell at La Hogue. While Armender and Ashby pursued Panettiere, Russell was chasing Tourville eastward along the Cotentin coast. Without anchors, Tourville was unable to do more than beach his ships, which he was able to do, leaving 3 at Cherbourg and taking the remaining 12 to St. Vaast La Hogue. Actions at Cherbourg. The Soleil Royal, Admirable, and Triomphant were in such bad shape they had to be beached at Cherbourg. There they were destroyed on the 3rd of June by Vice Admiral de Laval, attacking from longboats and with fireships. Actions at La Hogue. Meanwhile, Russell had turned on the remaining ships. These had sought refuge at La Hogue where they would be under the protection of the assembled land forces and a battery. On the 3rd of June and the 4th of June, the Dutch and English attacked with longboats. By this time the French crews were exhausted and disheartened. The Allies successfully deployed shore parties and fire ships which burnt all 12 French ships of the line which had sought shelter there. This last action became celebrated in England as the Battle of La Hogue. Conclusion. The dispersal of the French fleet put an end to the invasion plans, and the Allied victory was commemorated in England by a fleet review. Following the battle, the French abandoned the idea of seeking naval superiority for its own sake, adopting instead a continental strategy on land and pursuing a war against trade at sea. The battle is seen differently on either side of the Channel. The English have seen the action as a single action over 6 days. It has often been referred to as the Battle of La Hogue, or simply Hogue. The French, on the other hand, have seen the various actions as separate battles, of Barfleur, Cherbourg and La Hogue. However, more neutral observers, such as Mayen, have also seen the action as a whole, as does Pemsel, and naval actions over a period of days were not unusual for the time. The term, Battle of Barfleur and La Hogue, is a compromise description for the whole event. Both sides also regard the outcome differently. The English claim this as an outright victory. The French, while acknowledging La Hogue and Cherbourg as defeats, prefer to claim Barfleur as a victory. The English view of this as an out-and-out victory, while plausible, is flawed. In earlier times it was widely celebrated, though by Mahan's time it was seen as less important. The French invasion plan was foiled, but La Hogue was not the devastating blow to the French navy it was once thought. French losses were quickly made good, and by the following year Tourville was able to inflict a defeat on the Allies at Lagos. Although the French dropped their invasion plans for the rest of the conflict and switched to a guerre course, this was a matter of policy rather than necessity. However, the French view of the action at Barfleur as a victory is similarly flawed. The actions at Cherbourg and La Hogue can only be seen as defeats, but the view of the action at Barfleur as a victory is not tenable. The strategic aim, to concentrate the fleet and seize control of the Channel before the Allied fleet had assembled, had already failed by the 14th of May, and the chance for invasion was lost even if the battle had never taken place. Tactically, Tourville made the best he could of a difficult situation. He made skilled use of the tides, first to disengage his fleet and, later, to escape, but with no ships lost on either side and the action ending with Russell in hot pursuit. It can be seen at best as inconclusive. Nevertheless, historians have generally acknowledged the skill, bravery, courage and ferocious fighting ability of the French in this action. Barfleur remains a battle of which the French are most proud. Ships involved: England, 56 ships. Netherlands, 26 ships. Total Allied, 82 ships, plus auxiliaries. France, 44 ships, plus auxiliaries.